Hello, welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. To interact with us, we love seeing you every week in our Facebook stream. So hello and good evening to Facebook land, as well as to our YouTube channel. So hello, and love to see you chat and interact with us over there. You know me, my name is John Ruark. I'm a past master of the Patriot Lodge number 1957 in Fairfax, Virginia. And let's see, we have a full house tonight. Let's go over to Jason Richards for his introduction.
Hi, John. How's it going?
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. I'm Jason Rich. I'm a past master of a little lodge in Clifton, Virginia, known as Acacia Lodge number 16, and a member of an affinity lodge connected with George Washington, the George Washington University, called the Colonial Lodge, the Colonial Lodge number 1821 in Washington, D.C.
Excellent. Over to Mike the intern for his introduction.
Good evening. Mike Cambrick here, Senior Warden and Lodge Education Officer at Lakeshore Lodge number 307 in Madison, Ohio, and I think Senior Steward at Castle Island Virtual Lodge.
Excellent. Good to have you. Let's see. Juan Sepulveda, how you doing? Yeah, take you off mute.
Juan Sepulveda here.
There you go.
Good evening. Juan Sepulveda here from Orange Blossom Lodge number 80 in sunny Kissimmee, Florida, and the brother behind freemasonryart.com. Good evening.
Excellent. And last but not least, Robert Johnson.
Hello, everybody. Robert Johnson, past master, Waukegan Lodge 78, and current sitting secretary at Space Novum Lodge 1183 in Libertyville, Illinois. Good to be with you.
Good to be with all of you. And special shout out to our patrons who've been supporting the show and keeping this Masonic education going for many, many years. You guys rock. Love to see you hang out with us. As said before, the Facebook group just for Knights and Squires of our Patreons have been pretty interesting lately. There's been a lot of good chatter about some really weird esoteric and philosophic concepts. So if you want to nerd out on that kind of stuff, love to see you over there. Just drop us some support at patreon.com/the Masonic Roundtable and keep this show going for many, many years. And before we get into tonight's topic, I did want to give a special shout out to St. John the Baptist Day. So here we are on the actual day. What's this, June 24th, 2021, as we're recording this. And looking through Facebook memories, do you guys remember what happened 4 years ago today?
Yeah, we
Yes,
had
I got
a
it.
fake celebration for the fake 300th anniversary of Freemasonry.
300. Yeah, I can't believe it's been 4 years.
I thought it was much more important. That was the day I got asked to be a member on the show.
Also,
And we've
momentous.
regretted it ever since.
Yes, a momentous event.
It's hindsight is 2020.
History is not always
No,
beautiful.
That's right.
So yeah, we were there exactly 4 years ago today. We were having a big event down in Alexandria, the George Washington National Masonic Memorial, having a great time, just celebrating the craft, celebrating each other. Yeah, it was just a fantastic day. And I remember after we kind of, got past the afterglow and the little honeymoon phase after it, we said, man, that was so much fun. Let's do it again. Should we do it another year or something like that? Better yet, let's do it in 2021 on the actual celebration of the 300th year of Freemasonry. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Unfortunately, due to COVID, our planning just went straight out the window. But maybe, again, like we were saying in the green room, that there's a possibility maybe 2 more years we might be able to get a chance to get together to celebrate another Masonic anniversary. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, and I'm going to push that out even more. So
Just keep kicking the can down the road.
that's right.
The Premier Grand Lodge was formed in 1957.
That's right.
1813.
And on this day, 7 years ago, Robert and I first met in person.
Wow.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's what really matters, not
That's what
UGLE,
matters.
which actually,
No.
John, was formed back in good old 1985.
1985. Yes. Good old 1985. Let's talk a bit about where this controversy of the history and the foundation of the premier Grand Lodge of England really started to come up, because if you haven't been following kind of the blogosphere for the past, since 2016, there was a little bit of a controversy that's spun up by some researchers, presented at the Quattuor Coronati Lodge of Research, where there's been some dispute on, was 1717 the founding of the premier Grand Lodge of England. And what I liked about this approach was that they were trying to, just follow the crumbs, the historical evidence of crumbs, rather than taking, what Anderson wrote in his book of Constitutions as the gospel truth. So I think it's interesting when you do the historical tracing of these things and try to find evidence of the events and persons and their titles, and did they exist at this time, at this place. You really start to open up a lot more questions. So I'm gonna kind of set the stage here with some of the things that I've heard through some research by Prescott, and then we'll kind of go around to some other clues that we found that can help get us toward possibly some understanding of maybe a different date other than 1717. So just to set the stage, if you're familiar with Freemasonry, we kind of owe the organized structure of Freemasonry to be around 1717, probably June 4th or June 24th, 1717, St. John the Baptist Day, as the foundation of the premier Grand Lodge of England, where 4 lodges got together and said, we need to form a Grand Lodge to keep ourselves orderly and start to charter and warrant new lodges. This was really kind of unheard of at the time, because as you've heard in Jason's presentation about Scottish Masonry and a couple other things, that pre-1717, the Masonry was not as structured, ordered, recognition and all sorts of other protocol and formality. It really wasn't there. It was an evolved structure. Jason, you wanted to chime in on that?
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting because Freemasonry or Guild Masonry in England, for all intents and purposes, disappeared in, I think, about the 1500s. And that was because I believe it might have been 1400s. It was King James I in England it was King James in England, and he was at the same time King James in Scotland. He ended up decreeing that the guild system should be abolished, and so the guild system of Freemasonry was abolished. I think it was either 1475 or 1575.
Yeah, Jason, according to a lot of the texts that I've read, it says that specifically there are 0 guild or operative lodges in England after 1500. And in Scotland, they last a little bit longer, and they go until the late 1500s. Now, the book is written by English Masons that I'm going to refer to, so there seems to be some undertones of animosity of who comes first. In fact, they try to mix they say, 15th century in England, but they'll use different verbiage for the year 1500 and the 16th century. They interchange the terms so that you inadvertently think somebody didn't come first.
Right.
But you're right.
Now, is that the Julian or the Gregorian calendar?
Jeez.
So it's James
Oh,
the First in England, James the Sixth in Scotland. Same person responsible for the King James version of the Bible, and it's strange because in England he abolishes the guild system, so Freemasonry essentially disappears, goes underground. At the same time, the king in Scotland, he, this must have been 1575 when he abolished the guild system in England. In Scotland, of course, he installs William Shaw as the master of the work, and actually mandates that lodges begin keeping records of their meetings. And this is again right at the turn of the 1600s. So it's very interesting to see his complete and utter distrust of the guild system in England, yet his actual leading to the guild system and ultimately speculative masonry thriving in Scotland, because around the turn of the 1600s you have the Shaw statutes that really codify craft masonry for the first time ever. And then throughout the 1600s you get probably because lodges now needed to keep written records, you get the intermingling of speculative masons and operative masons. And so the Masonic craft guilds actually were around in Scotland until several decades at least after the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. It wasn't until really about the turn of the 1800s where, due to the explosive growth of speculative Freemasonry, the operative guild system just kind of died off.
And that's in Scotland, right? So we're just
in Scotland, yes,
right. We're setting the stage there.
And you can trace that because the lodges were mandated to keep written records, and so you can go back
by the Grand Lodge
and figure out who. By King James the
By King James, right.
Yes. Grand Lodge of Scotland was about 130 years later. But in England, everything went underground, and there were, of course, no written records, so everything disappeared until the early 1700s when you started to have brethren meeting in taverns. Some lodges getting too big for their britches and saying, you know what, let's band together and let's rule. Yeah. Let's become a little empire, and then we'll split 30 years later and not come back together for another 70 years. It'll be great.
Christopher Wren is pissing us off, so we're going to start our own Grand Lodge system.
Yeah, with blackjack.
It's really funny that some of the text that we're looking at. I think one of the better books on this is it's pretty objective. Is the Celebration of the Craft Freemasonry? It's like a 175-year. Like a history of the craft, right? It's from UGLE. Yeah. And what's really interesting in this is that we are always thinking about where we came from, and many people subscribe to, okay, so we were guild, now we're speculative, because that's where we go in Freemasonry, right? And then the other thing that we start thinking about, or as we're reading and learning more about Freemasonry, is exactly what Jason just pointed out. They say, hey, there was a point where we were operative, then we let a few non-operatives in, and so there's this mixed period, and then it's pure speculative Freemasonry. So it creates this bonded link, this chain that we can trust. But one of the things
the millennials wrestling the control away from the boomers. Freemasonry.
Right. So
it still hasn't happened yet.
So the thing that's interesting though is it's not the story that they actually want to hold on to. They're more interested in this newer theory that says that there is no connection, that because operative lodges died off, that it's more probable that an organization probably just said, hey, that was neat, let's adopt that and teach this. And so it's totally disconnected. And they think it's pretty good. But again, no real history or no real evidence to suggest it other than the dude who wrote it, which is a guy named Colin Dyer.
So that holds parity with the ex nihilo origins of speculative Freemasonry, which posits that speculative Freemasonry just kind of formed out of the supper clubs and dinner clubs of England in the late 1600s. And so that could have been an organization that said, hey, they could have, happened across, some treasure trove of Masonic secrets from Scotland that were actually written down, or what have you, and said, hey, this is cool. Why don't we make a fraternity out of it? And,
Right.
let's do some cool stuff. And then, the Royal Society got a hold of it and said, ooh, yeah, sprinkle DMT and alchemy and all that fun stuff.
The original
but we just don't know because we don't have the written records.
Mm-hmm. So where again a lot of the records start to materialize is after Anderson's constitutions, right? Because that's when we start to write down what lodges met where, and get started with the assembly and warrants and charters under a Grand Lodge system, right? To kind of keep things orderly. So as we led up to this point in time now, where we're in the early 1700s, and we've got this speculative Freemasonry that's, again, scattered, unorganized, but yet popular. You have to go look at where did the 1717 date come from? Well, it actually came from Anderson's constitutions. In fact, he wrote 2 editions of his constitutions, both with a 1717 date. He wrote one edition in 1723, and then added more information in his 1738 edition. And that's where you start to ask some questions. What happened between 1723 and 1738 that what all this new evidence was found to add more to the story? And in fact, he goes on to elaborate. We've talked about this in other episodes. The tracing the origin of Masonry back to Adam in a very flowery way, appealing to some of the like the Cook manuscript and the like. But what's interesting is that there is one sort of lineage that's added to the 1738 version of the constitutions, and that is the lineage of which lodges met where to choose their Grand Master and who the first 3 Grand Masters were. So only in the 1738 edition of Anderson's Constitutions, remember now, this is like 20 years after 1717, right? That we're much further beyond the actual event of where, we just remembered all this new additional information about our history.
The Gospels?
Yeah, you're just we'll fix it later. We'll fix it in post, right?
Oh, it's even better than that.
Yeah. So we find out that as written in the 1738 constitutions, that in 1716, a few lodges at London, finding themselves neglected by Sir Christopher Wren, they wanted to basically unite under better terms, and were thus named. Which of these 4 lodges came to form a Grand Lodge? So here are the four lodges, and it's important to figure out where these came from. We have the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, which is where we get the Goose and Gridiron, decorations and all that in Freemasonry today. We also have the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane near Drury Lane. The third is the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, right inside of Covent Garden. And then finally, you have the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. So what you have here is, and by the way, that these 4 lodges, and they were specific on not only the name, but also the place that they met around the time frame. So that way, if there's another Apple Tree Lodge, you can say, well, no, it's this one that was here. We know, who they were, and what did they do? They actually ended up having a dinner at the Apple Tree Tavern in 1716 to elect a Grand Master. So that's where we get the first Grand Master chosen as Sayer identified. But this is where it's identified because we really don't have a lot of external information to back that up. Someone going to jump in, add to that?
Yeah, there's no Apple Tree Tavern in that location at that time. According to Prescott and Summers, there's nothing there. Now, I mean, they did quite a bit of sufficient research on that, but yeah, there's no Apple Tree Tavern there.
And that's been fascinating.
Yeah, and on top of that, then you have the fact that they didn't add this till 1738. So you have the question of why, and there's a lot of points to that about some of the past Grand Masters in this list, whether or not they were actually Masons prior to 1721, right, or in some aspect at all, because they were trying to get. At least one of them, if I remember correctly, was trying to get some Masonic charity and so forth. So they were trying to, so there's some theory there that they were trying to provide proof of that in order to, but, in that case, then that actually really skews the credibility of Masonry at that point as to, fraud.
Right. Yeah. And so, Dr. Andrew Prescott was the one who kind of did this research in 2016 and published these papers, trying to find the origin of this Apple Tree Tavern, especially if it's where they said they met to choose the first Grand Master. Kind of want to make sure that it exists historically. So he did the lengthy research to try and find the location of said Apple Tree Tavern. And long story short, you'll probably send some links to the actual research paper and YouTube video straight from Prescott's mouth. Cannot find it in any sort of like historical records. We do have evidence of an Apple Tree Tavern on or near Drury Lane, which is right near Covent Garden. So it at the around the near time frame.
You're the Muffin Man too.
Yeah, I knew that was going to come up at least once, but not founded until 1723. So there was no Apple Tree Tavern at Covent Garden until 1723, based off of land plot records, sale records, and all that. They're in that same location. Okay, maybe it just wasn't documented. No, he looked back at papers, newspapers of that same location and found just commercial shops and the like.
Right.
So it's
so it couldn't have even been some other restaurant there like that. It just didn't exist.
Right. It was not a tavern.
And then
at the time.
What's next then is this. I was really big. I just adopted that theory. Like it couldn't have been 1717. I adopted it straight away just based on the historical evidence. I was amazed at the really intense response from Freemasons around the world, even researchers who said the first defense was, that doesn't matter. And it's like, well, okay, it matters, but I get it. And then was this rebuttal article that was produced in Heredom, which, I kind of took issue with initially because I thought, I was just like, this doesn't feel like a really great rebuttal. Because to me, I still don't see them answering the question, and maybe I missed it in the article, and if I did, I'm sorry. But I just didn't see that article.
You didn't miss that.
Where they said, oh, by the way, the Apple Tree Tavern thing doesn't matter because we know it was there and this is where it was. Like, they still didn't address the fact that it couldn't have been that. So at the very least, we just have to say that maybe the guy who wrote this, right, is just wrong. No,
it's not anywhere in that rebuttal, to say, no, this is why you're wrong and this is where it was. But no, he sits down and he picks apart their analytical style of history. He points out that they try to use a Marxist analysis of history. And this is where I lose a little bit because I don't really know what the actual Marxist analytical style is. I just know that just by basing it on that, I go,
Critical theory?
Yeah, that sounds pretty off the wall, that it's not right. But it doesn't matter. It's that doesn't matter. I don't understand. The article itself really begins to break down every piece, though, of their research and shows that just because they say, because they attack Masonry for creating multiple traditions and then saying that they invented this main tradition, and this is it. And that yet, but from 1717 to today, they've reinvented tradition over and over again, which is what their article points out a lot. That's where his rebuttal goes into, because the way that they do little ad hominem attacks, he's now doing ad hominem attacks on them.
Gotcha.
You know, even though they do have, I mean, they have evidence on certain pieces, but what they actually do is attack a lot of things rather than provide fact that goes the other way.
Yeah, I just brought up here, if you wanted to see kind of where the location, the known location of the Apple Tree Tavern as established in 1723, it is actually there. It's still the intersection of the roads is still applicable. That if you were to zoom in on a map of London here, go north of the Eye, and as soon as you cross the Waterloo Bridge, over here, zooming in, there is an Italian restaurant, the Bella Italia at Wellington Street, which is at Wellington and Tavistock Street. In fact, if you turn on the Google Street View, there you'll find the actual modern day equivalent of the actual location of, which is now an Italian restaurant, not a tavern but close, of where the Apple Tree Tavern was located 1723 going forward.
So I say we all meet there and form our own Grand Lodge.
Let's do it.
2023.
So
in 2023.
if I could ask, I'd like to propose just a question based on and around this, because this is, it's supposed to be UGLE's birthday. So the one thing that the United Grand Lodge of England talks about in this book is that they once amended their history discreetly by removing things like, biblical stuff to adhere to historical accuracies. And I fail to see how this, in essence, is any different. I'd like to read you just this small bit from the book. It says, the traditional history, talking about Freemasonry, it is from the historical account enshrined in the old charges that the official or traditional history of Freemasonry set out in the printed constitutions of the 18th century is derived. Romantic and wholly fictitious though it is, the traditional theory of Masonic origin long held sway. Like other more feasible theories, it argued for a descent of modern Freemasonry from the working or operative stonemasons of the Middle Ages. But the traditional history goes back even further to the biblical patriarchs, notably Noah and Moses, and then by way of Nineveh, Egypt, and worthy Clark Euclid, to King Solomon and the building of the temple in Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar, and the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Then comes what might be termed the Gothic leap to the Dark Ages, to Charles Martel, St. Alban, King Athelstan, and the mystical Great Assembly of Masons at York under the Prince Edwin in AD 930. None of this has the slightest basis in truth, but to the 18th century Freemason biblical history and chronology was literally true, and an accurate knowledge of ancient and medieval history was far from widespread. Under such conditions, it was not self-evidently absurd that the craft could lay claim to such grandiose pedigree. By 1815, common sense had led to the traditional history being discreetly dropped from the constitutions, although old ideas die hard, and there has never been a shortage of enthusiastic romantics who seek for the fountainhead of the craft in the mists of antiquity. And so what I take from this is this idea that we have this glorified history back then, this wild pedigree, and we changed our constitutions discreetly to reflect historical accuracies. And here, now we have the constitutions that we portray today, right, that talks about 1721 and this formation. And that yet we know historical accuracy, once again, is the thorn in our side. But we're sticking to the story. I'm curious why.
It's kind of like Dave Filoni taking over Star Wars. You kind of have to fix some things that have now been pushed to Legends, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe just totally ignoring the previous movies and the the TV shows before, because we want to take this character in a different direction.
The retconning of Freemasonry.
Exactly.
Reboot.
No, we're looking at
Freemasonry,
it.
the reboot.
Someone called J.J. Abrams. Yeah.
There's Aliens. One.
We're obviously looking at it from a historical perspective. So here we are 3 centuries later, looking back and seeing, okay, how did it all begin? Like, what's the accurate timeline and narrative behind this? But if you think about their perspective whenever they were establishing the Grand Lodge, let's go forward to 1738, whenever Anderson is writing that second set of constitutions. I imagine it like this. Okay, Anderson, we need you to straighten this stuff out, because, like, yeah, we should have kept better notes of all this before. So here are the lists that we have. Here are the documents we have, and there's a few people that can remember what happened. Of course, 1738 is what? 17, how many years later?
It's like 21 years later. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so 21 years later. Just try to think about the kinds of things that you did 21 years ago.
That you didn't write down.
Mm-hmm. That you didn't write down. So to the best of his ability, with the documents that he had at hand and the pressure that perhaps he's getting from Grand Lodge, he's like, hey, here's what I can piece together from this. Does that sound right? And here we're talking about just 2 decades. Like, yeah, that's good enough, because it's
nobody will check us 3 centuries from now.
Exactly. It's like, how many things do we do today that we're looking at them from that point of view? It's like, okay, 200 years from now, people are going to look back and it's like, no, they're not going to care whether we bought this building or the other building. Just think about it. Like, we're talking about taverns. We're talking about meetings in taverns, right? So we're not talking about this giant celebration or something that left a big trail of crumbs. If think about what taverns or bars or weddings you went to 20 years ago, and could you accurately recount those today? So I just find it interesting. I don't see it necessarily as a nefarious attempt to doctor the books. It's almost like, this is the best I got. Does this make sense to you? Yeah, well, sign it and let's post it.
Yeah, I mean, to that argument, Juan, that's a great thing to bring up. Is, yeah, it's not nefarious, not for a minute. At best, right? Like, I don't know, I'm not using that term correctly, but I'll just
negligent.
say that I believe you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the right way to look at this. Perhaps is that it's the best they had, and also, do you think they knew that we would give a crap?
Exactly.
In 300 years, that we would be like,
that's
looking
what I think
back
about.
at this like, it's got to be.
See,
Yeah,
I'm on the fence on that. I could go either way, because, they knew that they were taking liberties for storytelling, right? But at the same time, when you look at, the woodcuts or the prints of these things, they were very ornate. There was a lot of time and effort in the typesetting of these, right? So it wasn't just like scratched on the back of a napkin. Like, this is like, we're going to document the history of the Grand Lodge as we kind of remember it from 21 years ago. So
from the same guy who said, Adam was a Mason.
Totally. We'll put it in there. Let's add it to the
Noah
book.
and his sons were all Masons, true.
They were right.
But
people were like, yeah, that sounds good. Why don't you write the history of Freemasonry?
Yeah. Hey, can I be first Grandmaster? Sure, no problem. We got you. I got you, bro.
Yeah. But honestly, looking back on it, I would like to sit back and say, you know what, it's great to say that it was 1717 or 21 or 23 or whatever. But to be honest, I don't even think that any of that is accurate. I think it's actually more accurate to say 1813. And
what happened in 1813?
Well, that's when the Premier Grand Lodge and the Ancients and Moderns merged.
Correct. Yep.
And well, I shouldn't even call it that, where the
reunification.
ancients took over, really, because that's where the degrees now
Merged.
came from. Yeah, they merged. I mean, you had the same guy who was grandmaster of both organizations, and when he merged them together, so to speak, just said, "Okay, by the way, we're doing this now." And that's what I mean. Granted, there was some time. I mean, they started this and had discussions, but in the end, the ancients won out, and that's the Grand Lodge structure we now have that is now with the UGLE and so forth. But prior to that, there was still no solid, unified Grand Lodge system that was being followed. And honestly, you can look back, you can even look further and say, okay, wait a minute though, but it didn't continue to follow a single thing, because now we have, the Grand Orient of France and Le Droit Humain and so forth that actually can trace their origins to this point in time as well.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So where did we get the 1721 date then? Because I set things up to say there's some ambiguity about what got changed.
Well, that's when they really had the big public ceremony, and was the Duke of Montague made the new Grand Master and so forth, and that's when royalty stepped in and was a part of it, which made it public, which made it popular, and they had the parade and everything for this. There was actually prior to that there is none of this, no records of them anyway, having the marches in the streets with everybody in their aprons and their their jewels of office and so forth. That was this with John, Duke of Montague.
Right. And that came up recently also, in about the 2016 time frame, when they actually found the London Lodge of Antiquity No. 2's minute books, and they were actually able to they saw in the minutes that it described a large and well-organized event, where again you're adding the royalty to that, therefore kind of making it documented and formal rather than some guys at a tavern that doesn't exist, right? You actually have minutes, because it's not official, it's not legal until it's in the minutes, right? Ask any secretary of any lodge. It doesn't happen unless it's in the minutes, and we read it to you verbatim at every meeting in Virginia.
10 times.
Yes.
But but I'll even throw it out there, because this was used to rebut some of my statements on that when I gave my presentation on this at R300. And that was, we are talking 300 years ago. Some lodges disappeared, some secretaries didn't turn back the minute books or whatever. Some of this documentation that we're looking for may not exist only because it's lost. It didn't get passed on, or the lodge burned, or any of that. There's plenty of reasons why we don't have some of that documentation. Not to say that doesn't change certain facts, because we have this tavern that does not exist. Now, it's one of four though when you actually have that conversation. So just because you don't have the one doesn't mean the other stuff didn't happen.
Correct.
The way
And so I think it's interesting that Rick Berman provided a rebuttal to Prescott, because he also wrote a book for his Prestonian lecture, and I heard him speak at that a couple years ago, where he was digging up some more information on the foundation of the Grand Lodge, specifically those 4 lodges. And if my memory serves me correctly, I mean, you can he has a book called Foundations, Rick Berman Foundations, where he goes into detail on this, but basically there was an imbalance of power where one of those 4 lodges was much bigger and much more well established than the other 3. So it really wasn't 4 lodges meeting. It was one kind of saying, hop along with me or else I'm going to crush you guys, right? And so even then, when you hear 4 lodges met to agree, and I think even the social class,
wasn't it 3 small lodges and the big lodge?
Right.
Yeah.
And they had different levels, I believe, of like social class in those as well.
And they were probably all plural members.
By the way, the title of that book is The
happen till
Foundations of
later.
It's the foundations of modern Freemasonry, the Grand Architects, political change in the scientific enlightenment, 1714 to 1740.
Is that his Prestonian lecture title?
That's the book that he wrote. So I don't know if that's,
Mm-hmm. So anyway, here we are, 300 years later, right, to the 1721 date, where we can at least celebrate on John the Baptist Day that something may have happened 300 years ago. So the real question becomes: is it still relevant? Is this an issue? Does it change how we look at the fraternity, or at least the founding of the fraternity, and that kind of thing? So now we're kind of shifting from the academic historical side of the conversation to now more of the what does this mean to modern Freemasonry? And I'll hand it over to Juan. What's your impression of looking at these new dates, 296 years later?
Yeah, it makes me think of what RJ was saying earlier, that when confronted with the new information, some people were saying, well, who cares? Like, so what? And he said, well, it is important, right? So it is important to the degree that as best as we can, we would like to keep track of the important events in the fraternity. So it is important from that point of view of documenting things properly, of making sure that we have the order of things correctly, and that we have the actual names of the people that were involved in the different events that took place. That it is important. But is it important to the point where I should change the way that I feel about Freemasonry, or the way that people should feel about Freemasonry as a whole? Well, from that prism, it isn't important, because if we look at the purpose of what Masonry is, that purpose shouldn't be affected by discrepancies in dates, discrepancies in different things. And just in passing, somebody else made the comparison to scriptures. If I know a few of us have read a few books by Bart Ehrman, where he documents some of the discrepancies that are available in the Bible, where there are dates within a few of the Gospels that contradict each other.
Mm-hmm.
Did they go this day, or did they go the other day? Well, it matters from a historical point of view, trying to understand what really happened, but does it affect your dogma? Does it affect your belief? Does it affect the way that you feel about the positive lessons you may find in Scripture?
Only if you take a literal interpretation of the Bible and can't reconcile the fact that it's primarily allegorical.
No, you create a fifth gospel, a fifth synoptic gospel. That's the amalgamation of the previous four.
Yeah, the good news is that I have not I have not encountered a single Mason who takes any of the scripture literally. I have not come across one.
That's true.
Except for the ones quoting abomination of marital same-sex relations.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe I found a ton of them.
With their tattoos.
With their tattoos, yeah.
Cotton polyester blend shirts, yes.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's shellfish.
No, I agree, Juan. From a historical record, it absolutely matters. And I think we get so invested in history, and in the permanence of history, and the historical record is anything but permanent. And so we get invested in a date and, the myth of the Masonic founding. And, it was like, John Hairston's book, Landmarks of Our Fathers, and the historical revision of the founding of Prince Hall. Like, that caused a major uproar in Prince Hall Grand Lodges in the United States. Not all of them, but some of them.
Yeah.
And
more than you think.
it's the same thing here. We get attached to the mythos of Freemasonry, and we lose sight of what the story is supposed to represent. Four lodges coming together, trying to make a speculative, philosophical Masonic body that's bigger than themselves, and propagating that throughout the world. That's hugely compelling, hugely dynamic, and hugely important. It doesn't matter if they started meeting in 1717 or 1721. And we should be flexible to the fact that we're dealing with the limits of historical knowledge, imperfect information, incomplete information, too many sources to dig through, and missing sources that'll never be recovered. So it's only natural that as more sources come into play and more advanced mechanisms of combing through the annals of history come into play, and are more widely available with the digitization movement of print sources. We just have to understand that the wheres and the whys will change, and the hows will change, I say, but not necessarily the whys.
I would like a little bit of intellectual humility, though, when it comes to the craft nowadays, right? Okay, 300 years ago, there was not the lens of historical critique and record keeping, frankly, that we have today. And then add on top of the fact that everything's more digital now and can be instantly accessed rather than, archived somewhere. So, we should hold everything going forward at a higher standard, right? We should
Sure.
also go back and look for the actual truth, because that's what we're kind of here for, right? We're here to discover truth, and but also be honest about how we're approaching that, right? Because look, there are some things that are allegorical in our ritual. There are some things that are literal in our ritual, right? There are some things that are allegorical in our history of Freemasonry, going back to Adam, and then there are some things that are literal about these things. These events happen on these days. They got these charters, right? So my wish for Freemasonry is that we did a better job of separating that explicitly to the best of our knowledge, right? That we could say, we believe that Anderson was doing this when he was, assembling his 1738 constitutions, rather than these constitutions are the truth. Read it. This is how it was, right? And that, to that point, that's what happened when Hairston came out with some updated information about the founding of African Lodge Number 1, right? That there were Grand Lodges that refused to accept that. They're like, no, that's not what it says on our website. We had our historian in 1957 put that together, and he did his research, and I'm going to believe
the website hasn't been updated since
1957. So as long as we are just honest about the conversation, about what things are literal, which things are allegorical, which things are meant to be embellished, I think we could do a better job of that.
The embellishment, I was just going to say, the embellishment doesn't stop there, right? I mean, since the foundation of the craft, even when we had an embellished story, it continued to move in an embellished way with the creation of a Knight Templar origins and a Rosicrucian origin to the craft. Those are right
Or
there,
blood.
and in my opinion, on par with the same type of inaccuracy.
Absolutely.
Think how.
Yeah.
I invite you to think of how, I want to say, immutable it must feel. Like, it seems immutable now, but if you are creating, let's say we all got together and we decided to create the Sovereign Order of the Masonic Roundtable, right? And it's just us. These are just guys coming together, putting their thoughts, establishing some rituals and things. We may not see it from that romantic and zealous point of view as the people that, for whatever reason, 100 years from now are thinking, "Wow, it was the Knights of the Masonic Roundtable. They put together these they codify these tenets with the vision of perfecting humanity. And here we are, 5 guys just scattered about with our own opinions, our own different approaches to life, putting something together. So I think of that. I think of, when you're putting something together or trying to organize something like what they were attempting to do in the 1717, 1721, or 30 or 1815, were they thinking about it from that romantic point of view as we are today? Maybe not, but it's still important. I mean, I think it's so the lesson behind all of this. If you're doing something that you think it's important, document that stuff, write it, not on your
yeah.
not on your Google thing. No offense, John. Write it on paper.
Will be there forever.
Not on your Google Docs.
Yes.
Yeah, not on your Google Docs.
That they'll eventually decide they want to replace and just send you an email that says, "Hey, we're retiring Google Docs." Sorry.
Exactly.
They kill everything.
On the 23rd, prepare yourself.
Yeah. And speaking of the 23rd, how about the 23rd year of 1700? 1723 is the entry dated Monday 24 June 24, 1723 is the first official record of speculative masonry.
All right.
So I think we need to have another show
Let's
in a
do
couple
it.
years.
Let's do it. Maybe an event. 2023.
Putting it in.
It's all about the minutes.
Put it in your Google
All
Calendar.
about the minutes.
Yes. All right. So now we're at the point of the show where we ask the final question. We'll go around, starting with Mike the intern, and the final question is: so what's the date?
I don't think it's anything we've figured out yet, to be honest with you. I'd like to say it's 1721, based on my own historical research from before. I'd love to believe it's 1717, but actually, even when you read that Anderson's Constitutions, where they describe that first meeting, they actually mention that they met in the forms of an ancient Grand Lodge system, even, and they actually mention ancient Grand Lodge in that as well. So it's like, how did they come up with this new Grand Lodge if there has already been a Grand Lodge? So is there one even older that we're not aware of?
So there you go. Excellent. All right, Juan, what's the date?
Fortunately, I can refer to the official record and go to our poll in our YouTube chat, and
thanks.
it's officially 1717. 60% of the respondents said it's 1717. So I honestly don't know. The more I read about it, the more vague it becomes, and I don't feel like we really have to hang our hat on any date. As the information comes in, we'll adjust our understanding. I'm not, just like Hammy said, I would love for it to be 1717. There's so many perfections to that I appreciate. But if it's some random date in 1723, I'm not going to be disappointed. So great conversation, brothers. Thank you so much for always participating with us live. If you never caught one of these episodes live, put it on your calendar. Thursdays, 9:30 p.m. Eastern time, and
your Google Calendar.
Put it in your Google Calendar or a sticky note in your Trapper Keeper. That's it for me. Thank you so much for everything. I'll see you guys in a couple weeks. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Excellent.
Oh, I forgot. Go to thewindingstairs.com.
Yes.
I have some new stuff, including tank tops, hoodies, for all of those who are not in the heat zone.
And I'm gonna give you a plug too. The Goose and Gridiron shirt.
Yes.
Since we talked about that.
That's true. It's one of my most popular designs in the store. I created a very discreet design that is a nod to the 1717 official date. Go check it out. thewhitingstairs.com.
Alrighty, Jason, what's the date?
Depends on the source. So you have to ask yourself what's more historically accurate.
Wrong. We were looking
The
for
primary
what
source
your Grand Lodge
documentation.
says. That's the right answer. It's whatever your Grand Lodge says.
Okay, I'm not going to comment on that. So if you go from the standpoint of the first primary source documentation that RJ talked about, you can trace that source back to 1723. If you want to go with a secondary source from an author who had a track record of writing allegorically, and writing about information that cannot be corroborated from other sources. I'm referring to Anderson here. Then the date is 1717. But we'll never know for sure. I just don't think those historical records exist anymore. They perhaps did at one time. Perhaps somebody wrote something on the back of the napkin and said Freemasonry is going to be big one day. It's going to be huge. It's going to go to the moon. And it did. But I think instead of focusing on the date, while it's good to commemorate, how far we've come, and how far we haven't in some ways in 300 years, it's also good to dig into the story behind the narrative and why this seemed like a good idea to come out of the shadows and come, be a part of something bigger and grow yourself into the oldest and largest fraternal organization in the world. And I think that's the cooler story.
I'll take it. Robert, what's the date?
It was the best non-answer I could give you.
You should run for politics.
The date is this date, prior to 79 CE, because
there you go.
It's
you have a square.
In 1896, Naples discovered Masonic mosaics in Pompeii. So that has to be the start. That has to be when it started, definitively. No, I love the idea of. Did I stop sharing? What's going on?
I don't know. I still see your screen.
Weird. Well, let's turn it on. There we go. So I love the idea of a 79 AD or all these wild romantic ideas of when things could have happened. I'm inclined as a secretary. I think if I want to talk definitively, I'll say that's all well and good. I'm going to look at 1721 more than 1717, and I'm going to look at 1723, that first official document with minutes as my official start. Right, like if I go to a bank and I want to start an organization, I got to show minutes of that organization, and those minutes matter. And so for me, that's what it's about. That's the historical accuracy part of this. But again, I also kind of don't care. I think Freemasonry has done a wonderful job and spoken for itself over the last 300 years at least. I think the romanticized stories about where we come from have aided the understanding of the allegories that are contained within just those Blue Lodge rituals. So I don't know. I think it's a really beautiful system that we have, and I totally agree with Jason. Don't get hung up on so much of our origin. And maybe it's even cooler to say since time immemorial. We don't know, and that's okay, and that's awesome. Having a mystery is kind of cool. So that's where I stand. And before I shoot it back over to you, John, I just want to say thank you to everybody out there watching the show. We're at 345 episodes. This is awesome. And it's awesome to talk with people, on the YouTube channel every week. Now, for I'm kind of announcing it here. I think the first time maybe on this show is that I reached out to the Philosophical Research Society. They have fully backed the idea and are really excited about it. Actually, I'm going to be putting together a live table read with some familiar voices and faces that you'll see. If you ever watch a cartoon where they all sit around and they do a cool table read that's dramatized and you have a good laugh, but you experience kind of this cool thing too. We've got some of the coolest people in Masonic education, familiar voices and faces. We're going to be doing a live dramatized table read of Initiation of Plato via Zoom. I'm finishing up the cast now, and we're going to be putting that on together soon. And I'm really excited about it. It's going to be a lot of fun. And of course, having the blessing of the Philosophical Research Society is also awesome. So they're really excited about this. Bringing Hall's work or Hall's imagination, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, back to life. So I'm excited about that. If you like Masonic Podcast, 9:30s, Sunday nights, Whence Came You is always waiting for you. Thanks.
Sweet. Thank you. Let's see, over to me. Final date. What I like about this is that I can honestly say that I can have my mind changed, where if there's new evidence, as with most things in life, if you find new evidence that supports maybe something contradictory to what you should be able to at least look at the evidence and hold it at the same time as you're holding your current belief, and weigh those equally, right? That's like step one, is to be presented, not ignore it, but at least accept it for what it is, and then provide some judgment. So, I'll say I'm willing to say my mind's been changed, and if we have historical evidence, trust the science. If you want to say we have evidence that 1721, there's documented evidence of a celebration that comes from a different source than what one guy says, then we have to take that as new evidence going forward. So I'll stick with 1721 for now until we find more evidence later. But I think that's the whole point. It's fascinating to look at our origins. I'll say, I'm somewhere between the it does matter and it doesn't matter camp. But again, I would like to know what the right answer is, and then we can talk about the history and the evolution of those dates as we go. But that's it. I want to thank you all very much for watching. I hope you guys have had a great St. John the Baptist Day, and we'll see you next week. Keep searching for more light. Have a good night.